Pit Fight by William Price Fox. During the 3 years we lived near Camden, South Carolina, my father owned a roadhouse. It was a big place with 22 booths for parking, a dance hall, 6 cabins, a barbecue pit, a red room for roulette, craps, blackjack, and chuck-a-luck, and a blue room for poker. There were over 100 lights burning at night. From Logan Watts' store a mile down Route 1 and across the field from the schoolhouse, you could see the big neon pig wagging his tail and the sign that read Bill's Place. The roadhouse has nothing to do with the story, but it will give you some idea of the kind of gambling that was going on in the late 30s around Camden. The story starts at Watts' store. It was a long, high-ceilinged building with a Southern Bakery sign stenciled in red and blue on the screen door. Inside the store, 3 mule collars hung down from the center beam that ran the length of the room. Barrels of meat, smoked fish, pickles, and hog's feet were on one end of the counter. Directly behind the counter on the backboard, rows of rice, beans, and sugar were neatly stacked in plain brown paper bags. Watts also sold fertilizer, clothing, beer, school supplies, and Texaco gas and oil. Grady Lee was my best friend that year. We were both 15. The only thing you can't do in Kershaw County at 15 is vote. Watts had promised to take us to the pit fight. The day arrived. We had been hanging around the store since 8:30. It was noon and Watts had said nothing. We were afraid he had forgotten or that he'd changed his mind. The fight was to begin at 1:30 in Claude Jenkins' pit. Now, Watts had a bad temper, and we didn't want to remind him he had promised. We were afraid to ask and afraid not to ask. I decided I'd wait until he started. If he had said nothing by then, I'd speak up. I rehearsed my brief speech as I paced back and forth between the stove and the fertilizer bags. Watts was in the back. Finally, Grady could stand it no longer. He sang out, "Mr. Watts!" I stopped breathless at the stove. "Yeah, what is it?" He sounded irritated. Grady chirped back, "Mr. Watts, you want us to sweep up the store for you?" He grinned at me. Watts didn't answer. Grady's grin vanished. We knew that Watts had decided we were too young to see the fight. He came out of the storeroom hunching into the brown cardigan sweater he wore right through the summer. "Where's my pipe?" Grady leaped. Right here by the scales." Watts grunted, took the pipe, and started outside. We stood behind him on the gravel driveway as he locked the door. He turned and looked at us as he began lighting his pipe. "Still want to come?" I said, "Yes, sir," and Grady nodded. His pipe was lit. He shook out the match. "Okay, let's go." Grady grinned and nudged me on the arm as we followed Watts down the path towards the woods. The 2 hogs rooted in Joe Brown's old cotton patch. They had been field raised, and in the distance their long legs and their thin flanks made them look more like dogs than hogs. We passed through the small woods and out into Claude Jenkins' field. The pit was on the far side of the field. We could see the crowd beginning to gather. Watts stopped and looked back at the woods. He had dark brown eyes and dark, heavy brows. His hair was streaked with white. He looked serious. "I'm going to put it to you straight. This ain't going to be a regular pit fight. Luke Finley's got himself a wildcat. It's going to be a slaughter, and you might as well know it now. If I had my way, this fight would have been called off. I don't care what they say about this Georgia dog." He paused and then added, "Now, if you boys want to light out back through those woods, nobody is going to know a thing." It was the longest speech I had ever heard from Mr. Watts. There was more. "What do you say?" I spoke quickly. "We want to come." Grady said, "Yes, sir, we want to see it." Watts said nothing. He started across the field. We let him get 5 or 6 paces ahead of us. Grady showed me his crossed fingers. In the middle of the field, Watts stopped again. He looked back. "Dadgummit, I knew that dog was around here someplace." We looked back towards the woods. At first there was nothing. Then we saw Red, one of Watts' hounds. Watts called, "Okay, Red, come on out." The big dog passed the last scrub oak tree at the edge of the woods and started towards us. We walked back towards the dog and then stopped. The hound got closer and closer to the ground as he neared Watts. His long tail was chopping back and forth, kicking up red dust. He took the dog's head in his hand and said, "Red, damn your soul anyway. I told you I didn't want you along." The hound's tail wound under his belly, and his ears flattened sadly. Watts looked straight at Red. Red's head dropped lower and lower. He wrestled the dog's head in his hands. "Now, boy, I want you to go back to the store and wait for me. Now, I don't want to turn around and see you sneaking back through them woods." He turned the dog around and slapped him lightly on the rear. The big dog started back across the field. Once he paused and looked back, but Watts, with his hands deep in the cardigan's pocket, was heading for the pits. As we neared the pit, the Hall brothers and Earl Esty walked out to meet us. It was still early. Earl pulled his baseball cap lower as he said, "Watts, what do you think? What do you think about it?" Watts said, "Not much to think. It's going to be another slaughter." Earl paused and said, "There ain't going to be much of a fight then." Watts said, "That shouldn't be hard to figure out." At 12:45, Luke Finley's Ford could be heard behind the woods. It came into the view at the south end of the field. Finley straddled the car over the old furrows that ran directly towards the pit and into the crowd. He had a friend with him in the front seat. The Wildcat would be in the back seat. After Finley and his friend parked and walked over to the water bucket, we moved in to look at the Wildcat. The back seat had been removed, and the cane cage sat squarely on the steel floor. The cage was big, but the cat made it look small as he moved back and forth. He was buff-colored and short. The shortness had packed his muscles together, and they bunched at the hindquarters. His shoulders were narrow and solid, and he carried his head low. He must have weighed 50 pounds. The trip had irritated him, and the heavy breathing rocked the cage against the metal floor. And I saw those fierce green eyes. I knew that cat could never lose. And then, as we watched, the cat stuck a paw between the cane bars. The paw was small as it came out. Once out, it swelled up and extended 4 long claws as if he were yawning. His claws were well over 2 inches long, and they had fish hooked into fine points. At the water bucket, I bit the tin cup to keep from shaking. Parnell Taylor's pit bulldog was from Savannah. The dog was 3 years old and stood as if he were on show. He was beautiful. He held his head square and high, and the sleek muscles under the brown coat glistened as he breathed. Most of the dog's weight was in his head and shoulders. The rear tapered back into smaller and smaller muscles to the short back legs. This dog had been bred to fight, and all during the confusion before the fight, he stood like a rock by his master. At 1, Finley and his friend carried the cage to the edge of the pit. The cat had been in the pit several times and knew how to slide down the clay slide. When the bulldog saw the cat, he jerked himself up on his hind legs. He strained against the metal leash. Taylor held him firm. It was quiet for a minute. The breeze on the back of my neck suddenly stopped. My heart pounded. The dog was unleashed. The metal click sounded like a hammer. As the leash dropped to the ground, the dog's image blurred before me. The bulldog slid down the slide and jumped the last few feet. The dog hit the bottom and started to charge. At first his feet slipped, but then they took hold. He charged low and hard with his mouth opened up like a steam shovel. The lower jaw and the big teeth flashed as he crossed the pit bottom. The wildcat fell back from the heavy charge and rolled under the dog. In that second, he raked his claws into the dog's stomach. It was over before the dog knew what had happened. The brown dog didn't cry out. He sat down with his great mouth open in confusion. He had no stomach. The dog's eyes searched the crowd above for his master. He shifted his body as if to cover the darkening area beneath him. As he looked up again, his eyes met his master's. A look of shyness passed over his face and profile as he curled tighter in the area in which he was supposed to die. No one spoke as we crossed back over the field towards the woods. It was hotter, and the red earth held the heat close. I could barely walk, and Grady said nothing. I kept swallowing and breathing through my mouth to keep from being sick. We shouldn't have come. We shouldn't have come. Watts was right. Everybody was right. We shouldn't have come. We shouldn't have come. If I could only get away from those men. If I could only crawl away somewhere and vomit. I would lie down and vomit and cry for that beautiful dog. Earl Esty stopped at the fence post at the corner of the field and uncovered a spider-webbed pint of Kershaw County whiskey. Earl drank and passed it around. As I raised the bottle to my lips, I wondered why they hadn't sent me home. The whiskey was as hot as coffee. My throat caught fire. My eyes filled and ran over. For an instant, I couldn't breathe. I retched and began to gag violently. I didn't care who saw me. Back at the store, everyone was talking at once. Suddenly, Watts banged on the counter. The room quieted, and a faint tapping of the screen door in the wind was the only sound. "That settles it. I've had enough of these killings." Earl Esty said, "Watts, you can't do a damn thing about it." Watts shouted, "The hell I can't. You just wait." Earl said, "All right, tell the sheriff. You think there's only one county in South Carolina? Johnson can't enforce a thing outside Kershaw County, and you know it." Watts opened another beer. The cap bounced on the floor and rolled off towards the stove. Or he said, "I'm not calling any sheriff." Esty waited, then asked, "What are you going to do then? Shoot the cat?" Watts took a deep swallow of beer and said, "First I'm going to Macon. I got a cousin over there you boys don't know." He paused. There was a scratching at the door. It was red. Watts said, "Let him in." I pushed the screen door open and the dog came in. He went over to Watts and sat down at his feet. Watts was leaning on the counter now, and the smoke from his cigarette was winding up through the mule collar which hung above him. He said, "Yes, sir, I could have done this a long time ago. There's been too many dogs killed by this cat." Watts wasn't in church the following Sunday. Monday, Len Bishop opened the store and announced he would be running it for 3 weeks. August came. Now the sky was a paler blue, and nothing interrupted the sun. Between 3 and 4 o'clock, the shade from the Coca-Cola sign in front of Watts' store spread over the long bench between the Texaco gas pumps. The men took their beer outside and watched the thin traffic coming down the road from Camden. No one had heard from Watts for 3 weeks. Earl Esty said, "Maybe old Watts is in trouble. It ain't like him to keep so quiet." He paused. "It could be the old buzzard has a shotgun out for Finley, and he was hiding in the swamp and a gator got him." Joe Hall yawned and said, "Watts was weaned in that swamp. He knows every one of them gators by the first name." Len was looking down the highway. "Isn't that Luke Finley's Ford?" Joe said, "That's Finley, all right. I'd know that engine knock anywhere." Earl said, "Now I wonder what he wants." When Finley got to Watts' driveway, he steered around one of the big ruts and parked in the middle of the drive. As he crossed over to the men, he relit his cigar. When he walked, he didn't swing his arms. He moved along as if he were on oil. He said, "I'd never seen it so hot. I had to prop up the hood to get circulation. Damn car's 180 before I lay a hand on it." Joe Hall stretched and stood up. Finley, you haven't heard from Watts, have you?" Finley smiled and said, "That's why I stopped by. I read this letter. I'll read this letter after I get some water." He drank from the spigot. He didn't use his hands, but put his lips around the filthy thing the dogs licked and drank. Wiping his mouth and leaning against one of the gas pumps, he said, "Oh, that's better. I got this letter from Watts this morning. He's still in Macon." Finley drew a folded sheet of paper from his trouser pocket. His eyes traveled down the single page. "Here, I'll read this part. And what more, I have a dog that I'm entering against that hell-bred means of support you are claiming as a pit fighter. I am betting $1,000. The odds are still 4-1, so you had better start raising the 4,000. I will be in town Friday for the betting at 12 o'clock. After that, I don't want to see that face of yours until the fight at noon on Saturday." Finley coughed and sat down. The rest is a more personal note. He slipped the letter in his shirt pocket. "I'm covering all bets at 4-1. Spread the word around. If I ain't around, leave the money at Bill's." That Friday, Watts was in his store. All day long, the men asked him what he was fighting the cat with. He wouldn't talk. During lunch, when the men had all left, I said, "Mr. Watts, where did you get a pit dog?" He was tying rice packages. He had weighed a dozen half-pound bags as he tamped the rice down tight and said, "Boy, I got one. I just had to keep him quiet, that's all." He popped the string between his knuckles and reached for another bag. "Now get out of here and get your dinner. I'm not answering no more questions." Later that afternoon, Lynn Bishop asked me if I wanted to walk with him over to Watts' house. The store had been closed at 4. We crossed the yard. Watts' hounds raised their heads. The dogs all knew us. None of them barked. Only the small puppies of Belle made any noise. The rest were laying in the shaded corners of the fence and under the thick peach tree in the middle of the yard. There were 3 or 4 under the house, sleeping against the cool bricks of the chimney. Red was not in sight. When he didn't come out to see us, I figured he had gone under the house. A hen fanned her brood of biddies towards the water trough. On the low clothesline, a pair of overall pants and a blue work shirt hung motionless. Watts met us at the door. "Hurry in, boys. Keep the flies outside." We closed the screen door quickly. Watts said, "How about some iced tea?" He chipped ice in two large glasses and sliced a lemon in quarters. Lynn pulled a cane-bottomed chair away from the kitchen table. Lynn was slightly younger than Watts, but he was taller and thinner. He sat down heavily. "Logan, I'm worried." "I don't mean I'm worried about 200 I bet on your dog. I'm worried about you." He stirred 3 spoons of sugar into his tea. "You know you said dog in your letter to Finley. Now I want to know, Logan, and I want to know now. Do you have a dog?" Watts said, "I got me a dog, Lynn." "Where?" "Out in the yard." Lynn stood up. "You mean to sit there and tell me you're going to let one of your hounds get in that pit with Finley's cat?" "I am." "You kidding me, Logan? You are kidding." "Lynn, I got 3 dogs in that yard that can handle that cat. Spot could do it. Tag could do it. Red could do it." I interrupted. "Is it Red?" "It is. He's the strongest and I can count on him. He looked fine in Macon." Lynn walked across the room. "God almighty, Logan, what in the hell could you teach him in Macon?" "How to fight Finley's cat, that's what." "Does Red know he's fighting a wildcat?" Watts says, "He knows." He got up and went to the screen door. He called, "Red, come on, boy." The big red and white hound slid through the screen door. His eyes were calm and brown. He looked sleepy. He had been under the house. He wagged his tail when he saw me, but continued on to Watts. Red sat down and placed his head in Watts' lap. His long tail thudded softly on the floor. No one spoke for a while. The water began to drip on an empty pan in the sink. Lynn looked squarely into Watts' eyes. "Can that dog fight?" Watts ran his thumb down the wet tea glass. "He can fight and he knows how to fight. And that's all I must say about it." They talked about the betting. However, 4,000 had been bet against the cat, and Finley said that he would cover it with $16,000. While they talked, Red came over to me. I made a fist, and he opened his mouth and softly chewed on it. The mouth was tender and warm. As the dog rolled his mouth around my fist, I thought of the biddies in the yard. The smallest, weakest biddie would be safe in that soft retriever mouth. That night I lay awake and tossed back and forth. I was perspiring and my heart was pounding. I watched the moonlight on the far wall and wondered if Red would cry out when he felt the cat's claws. The pit bulldog had made no sound, but they were bred and trained for fighting. Red had been trained for birds, for rabbits, and for coons. In the shadows on the wall, I saw Red standing before the cat. It was raking its long claws over Red's lowered head. I got up and went to the kitchen. Sitting down at the table, I outlined a small square on the oilcloth. It was the pit. Would the sun be in all of the corners, or would there be a spot of shade for the dog to die in? There would be flies if Red died. I'd make Watts let me bury him all by myself. I'd carry him from the pit. The blood would get on me, and I wouldn't mind. The jukebox was playing loudly in the dance hall, and all the lights were on. In the distance, an owl made a low, sad noise. Next morning, Grady and I went out to the pit early. We were going to build a shelter to protect Red from the sun. Grady had a short saw and I carried a hatchet. I cut down 4 small scrub oak trees. After sharpening the tops, I gave them to Grady to square off. He laid the 4 pieces side by side and marked them with the saw blade. When he had them cut, we drove the spiked ends into the ground. The rest was easy. Chipping away some of the longer branches from the larger trees, we laid a roof over the 4 posts. We piled the roof higher and higher to keep out the heat and the flies. When we finished, I walked over to the pit. From the edge, I could see the spade marks in the hard clay near the sharp corners. The red clay was firm, and none had fallen from the steep banks. The bottom was clean and hard. I thought of Red and stared at the spot where the pit bulldog had died. The mark of blood was gone. I wondered who had cleaned it up. Watts arrived early with Red. They came through the woods and across Jenkins Field, just as we had done. The dog walked slowly behind him, and when Watts stopped, he stopped. Watts brought him over to the shelter. He said that the shelter was a good idea and motioned Red under the low roof. Red scratched at the earth to scrape away the hot surface. He circled twice, as if he were looking for something, and then he lay down. He put his nose close to the fresh soil, and in a few minutes he was asleep. I didn't want to talk to Watts. I walked back to the pit. Nothing had changed except now there was a bucket of white lime at the edge of the pit. I stood there for a while and watched the crowd gather. I pulled a bowl from a dead cotton stalk and walked between the benches and the soft drink cases that would be used for seats. Walked back towards Red. He was still asleep, and Grady was shooing the flies away with a long pine branch. As I watched him sleep, I broke the bowl along the seam. Grady was quiet. I could think of nothing to say. I broke the 2 black pieces in half again and let them drop one by one to the ground. The mule-drawn wagons and 3 or 4 cars had bumped and clattered over the old cotton field, but most of the crowd had come on foot. A few of the men had come as far away as Charleston and Savannah. A rumor went around that a state senator was in the crowd, but nobody knew him. Watts had mentioned in his letter that he wanted a place, a small stool right at the corner of the pit. Luke Finley had agreed on condition that Watts let himself be searched for a gun or knife. Everything was ready. At 11:50, Watts took his seat on the stool. He called Red over from the shelter. "Okay, now, boy," he said. "I want you to jump down there." He snapped his fingers. Red slid down the pit slide and jumped the last 3 feet. The pit was about 11 feet square and 8 feet deep. Red moved into the shade cast by Watts' shadow. He sat still for a minute, then stretched out with his eyes closed. "That son of a gun's going to sleep," somebody said. There had been rumors that some of the boys weren't going to allow Red to fight. When Red stretched out, Earl Esty jumped up. "What the hell, Watts? Let's call this thing off. I've seen enough." Watts said, "It's my dog and I know what I'm doing. Now don't bother me." Lynn Bishop said, "Leave him alone, Earl." Earl mumbled something and sat down. Finley and his friend carried the cat's cage up to the edge of the pit. Finley stopped. "Okay, Watts, I want to make sure you ain't carrying a gun." Watts frowned. "Okay, Finley, but I won't have your filthy hands on me. Send one of your boys over." After the search, everything leaned forward. This was it. Everybody was ready. Watts said, "Okay, Red, here we go, boy." I looked down at Red's eyes and my heart almost broke. I felt as though the dog were my brother. I remembered the bulldog without a stomach. Luke Finley took his hooked stick and raised the door of the cage. The cat was swishing back and forth. He was furious at the heat and the crowd and the cage. For a minute he wouldn't come out, but then he saw the pit and he remembered. He slid down the slide the way Red had and jumped from 4 feet. He landed in the middle of the pit and whirled to face Red. His back was hunched up and he was taller than Red. His claws were out on his front paws and they looked like razors. Red was up. He started moving around the cat. He circled the cat while Watts talked to him. "Easy, boy. Easy now. Just like Macon, boy. Just like in Macon." Red moved around the cat counterclockwise. By moving this way, he kept both eyes on the cat and avoided the sun's glare. The cat was ready. The thick muscles in his hind legs bunched and quivered. All he needed was one shot at the hound's belly. His thick back legs could do it in 2 seconds. The cat wanted Red to charge. Red might have charged. At least the crowd thought he might, but he didn't. He kept circling with his head pointed straight at that cat. Watts kept on in a slow, low, easy, and steady voice. "Easy, boy. Easy now. You remember. Just like Macon, boy. Just like Macon." The pit had large splotches of line around to kill the smell of blood. It was white, but where the shade lay in the corners it looked gray. Red began to track through it. At about the 3rd time around, a circle of tracks began to appear. The sun was overhead, but the sharp shade line was beginning to soften. There was not a sound. People were swallowing coughs and straining themselves not to shift on the hard seats. The 101-degree sun meant nothing. No one was conscious of their soaking wet shirts or their limp collars, only of the 2 circles being slowly inscribed 8 feet below on the lime-spotched Carolina clay. Every minute or so, Watts would come in with, "Good boy, Red. Easy, boy. Easy, Red. Just like Macon, boy. Just exactly like Macon." Red moved at the same speed, never gaining or losing a step. Slowly, methodically, moving around, listening to Watts for encouragement and keeping every muscle alive for anything. Red's eyes had changed. The soft brown had given way to a hard, cold black. Red had class. When the cat would feint as if to attack, Red wouldn't even break his stride or blink his eyes. Watts was still there all the time with his "just like Macon, Red. Easy, boy." The wildcat had won 9 fights. Only one dog had lived more than 2 minutes. All had died with the same wound. Their stomachs had been opened. The cat would trade anything, 1, 5, 50 of whatever Red had for that one shot at his stomach. One counter move was all he needed. His neck muscles, at first invisible beneath the short fur, now bunched and quivered. He spat, bared his teeth, clawed the ground, shifted quickly, angrily. The spot he was in was heating. He had to jump. He had to do something. He rushed forward 2 feet and braked. He spat, clawed at the air, and began hissing and backing up at the same time. Red didn't miss a stride. Finley shouted, "What the hell? What the hell's going on? This ain't no fight. This ain't nothing." "Shut up, Finley." "Shut up, hell. Look at him. He ain't fighting. Sick him, hound. Get him, you flea-bitten egg sucker." Red didn't hear Finley. Red only heard Watts, who through Finley's shouts kept up his "Easy, boy. Easy, Red. Just like Macon, boy." And the big dog kept on. The thin white line was now solid. The sun had passed the point where it struck the pit bottom. Still Red circled with that same fixed, idiotic look. His head pointed in and his body pointed out. I wondered if Red's neck might not freeze in that position. Would he be too stiff to do anything if the cat charged? Was Red getting tired by now? Maybe they would call the fight a draw. The cat was still moving in his small circle. He was now sliding around rather than shifting around. His stubby tail was on the ground and his front legs moved his body around. He had begun to wear a small circle of clay down to a slick finish. The cat began to twitch violently. His nerves had taken over again, and they were pushing him forward. He hunched up high, his long hair bristled all the way down his spine. He moved forward as if to spring. He feinted, spat, and backed up again. 10 more times. 12 more times around, and still nothing. Red looked calm, almost soft. His pace never changed. Some circles were larger than others, some rounder than others, but his stride, his speed, his position never changed. Watt's voice sounded lower now. "Easy, boy, easy. A little more time, boy. Just like in Macon, boy. Just exactly like Macon." The crowd said nothing, not one word. The tension was impossible. Something had to break. Once more Red went around, slowly, deliberately, head turned in, body out, eyes fixed with Watt's low, steady voice sounding like an incantation. And then the cat decided to take a shortcut. Instead of spinning his entire body around, he moved his head to its furthest position without shifting his body, and then whipped his head back to the other side. Watt's voice still steady. "Just like Macon." But by this time everything sounded the same. The next time Red went around, I saw a thin quiver behind his neck. Then it happened. The cat did the same thing. He didn't move around, but looked over his shoulder as far as he could, and then whipped his head back around to the other side. I had never seen anything move as fast as that long hound moved in that split second. As the cat whipped his head back, Red jumped. The position he was in was made for that jump. Everything was ready. By the time the cat had his head halfway around, Red had sunk his teeth into his neck. He leaped up over that cat and shook him 3 times with all of the strength from all of the hounds that had ever crossed the Piedmont. The bone broke twice. The cat was dead when Red dropped him. Watts let out a rebel yell that nearly broke my eardrums and dropped down in the pit and picked Red up in his arms. Watts was crying. He tossed the big hound up to me. "You're alive," I said to him, and held his sleek, sweating, wiggling body in my arms. It was impossible to believe that he had actually killed the cat. It was not only impossible, it was unnecessary. My only thought was that he was alive. He licked my face. I could feel the long tail slapping my legs. Someone taller took him from me and hoisted him up. They passed him around. The crowd just had to touch him. Red was great. Red was absolutely the most terrific dog in the world. His tail was flopping back and forth, and he had that beautiful hound smile on his face. I couldn't have been happier. He could not have been happier. Watts chased me and Grady out of the store at supper time. We came back after dark, but the door was locked. From the rear window, we saw them in there drinking moon and telling stories. Red was right there in the middle, gnawing on a big T-bone steak and flopping that tail back and forth. The end.